Hey guys, welcome to the 13th video in the L24 Engine Rebuild series. So at the time of recording most of this audio, this has been done for a decent amount of time. I have not had a whole lot of time to work on it, just with craziness kind of end of year at work and my business and stuff like that. But I unfortunately ended up catching COVID, and I'm doing okay. I don't really have, so far I'm not having too much of a problem with it. But I have a lot of time on my hands because I want to stay away from people for the standard 10 days or whatever. But the good news is I can finally finish up these videos and get caught up and show you guys what we've done with the engine. If you remember from, not the last video, the one right before this when we were last in the machine shop, the thing that prevented me from doing a lot of these final tasks last time I was there was that I just didn't have all the parts that I needed. So this time I just completely loaded up my truck with everything I could possibly need. I even have a box of stuff that I'm definitely not going to reuse, like spark plugs that those rusty old spark plugs that I pulled off the engine. I'm certainly not going to reuse those, but I have a box of stuff like that. And I even brought that just because I did not want to make this 6-hour drive again and be without any of the parts that I'm going to need. And I can say I'm really happy to report that now the engine is back and I had everything that I needed. This freeze plug you see here is a 40 millimeter plug that I didn't have with me last time. And we couldn't put on the front cover and do kind of anything that was coming up because one of the chain guides, as you'll see soon here, goes across there. So if you don't have the freeze plug in, you can't put that on. You can't put the front cover on. You can't do timing chain, cylinder head, really. I mean, you can't do a whole lot without that in there. So next I cleaned off the cylinder head with some solvent, made sure we had the 2 locating dowels in the cylinder head and put the gasket on it. And at that point I was able to just drop the cylinder head on top of the block. So to prepare the head bolts for installation, you're going to want to clean them in some kind of degreaser, which was done the last time I was at the shop. We put this really high quality lubricant that Jason uses for all of his work in the shop on the threads. Before that, we made sure to wire wheel them just so there's nothing, kind of gunk or anything stuck in there. And note that there are 2 different lengths of bolts. There's a long bolt and a short bolt. And I drew that diagram when I disassembled everything and tried to keep it in there. But really, the long ones are just the ones that go through the cam towers. So it's pretty simple. At this point, I was just installing a couple of the shorter head bolts to secure the cylinder head in place on the block for when we're going to install and secure the cam towers. You can see they're just sitting there. We're going to secure those to the cylinder head next. So next I began lubricating these rocker arm pivot bushings. And the technique Jason gave me for kind of all of the application of this lube before the bolts go in is to kind of have like a half moon around the top of the bolt where it's right next to the nut, and then like a line that goes down the threads. The one thing I would recommend is a lot of people completely assemble the cylinder head on a bench, and that gains you a couple things. For this, we just decided to have these head bolts in here and do most of the work with it installed on the head. We're going to torque it down pretty soon. But you can see we ended up removing a couple of the head bolts so we could get easier access to these bushings. And that ended up being really necessary, actually. So another reason I would consider assembling the cylinder head on a bench is, we'll talk a little bit more about this later when we come to it. We had to completely time the engine before we were able to finish installing all of the rocker arms, because eventually the valves were hitting up against the cylinder just because it wasn't timed. It was whatever the chain was at, whatever the cylinders were at, and we were rotating the valves into one of them was up top when it shouldn't have been. But just something to keep in mind if you can. It's not impossible, but I would consider it if I were you. Next, we installed these dowels, the locating dowels for the cam towers, and just kind of put them in by hand and then a soft mallet to put them in there. We did end up having to kind of recondition one, so if you could maybe get new ones, I would consider it for sure. So next you can install the cam towers on top of the locating dowels. Make sure you have them in order, of course. And another thing is when you have it in position there, you want to hammer on the sides and not the top there. So with all of the cam towers in place, just tighten down. Obviously, don't torque down or over tighten. Just secure the cam towers in place. What we're eventually going to do after the camshaft is installed is progressively torque them down to the spec. But for now, you just want to get them in place so you can install the camshaft. So of course you want to apply some assembly lube to the inside of the cam towers here, as well as the camshaft itself. And then you can just start carefully installing the camshaft. I discovered that this is a lot easier with some help. Of course, just take your time and gently go through. And don't force anything. So you can see at this point, everything kind of went smoothly. It was happy to go through each of the cam towers. But when we got to the last one, that wasn't quite the case. It didn't even want to go into that last one. And if we try to rotate, it was a little bit more resistance than we had experienced before. So what we did instead is we just brought it back. So Jason could remove that last cam tower there. And I'll show you a little bit about what we did to fix that one. It was the dowel that was causing the issue. But with that off, what we were able to do is then push it in the place where it would have been and say, okay, is this happy where it is? And you can see it rotated real easy at that point. So we knew that it was likely something to do with the installation of that one cam tower. So what we found out after Jason removed it from this cam tower, and I wish I had some better video of this, is it looked like I had gripped it too hard with the vice grips when I pulled it out of the engine. So, you know, it was a little bit deformed and it was kind of caving in a little bit. Just, you know, it only takes a little bit for it to be off. It's something that needs to be this precise. But it was hard to just even get it out of there. But once Jason did, he went over and I believe it sounded like he started up the wire wheel and or the grinding wheel, and he probably ground down part of it so that it wouldn't catch on the edge of I would imagine, the cylinder head is where it was having problems because it wasn't centered in that hole. But after he did that, you know, we verified it's actually, you know, not the crank, the camshaft itself that's causing the problem, because it kind of moves freely there. So we just rotated it down and installed it on there, and it was a lot better. The cam tower bolts get torqued to 25 to 33 foot-pounds. It's recommended that you gradually torque them up to that level and keep checking the rotation of the camshaft to make sure everything is still rotating freely. So one thing that's common with all kinds of engines is when you're torquing down the head bolts to do them in the correct order. If you remember from the removal process, it was you kind of start at the outside and you work your way in. So tightening them down, you start at the inside and work your way out there. And I'll put a picture up of a diagram that shows the order you should be doing this in. And the final torque level of these bolts for an L24 engine is 61 foot-pounds, and it recommends that you get up there in 20 foot-pound increments. So 20, 40, 61 is what we did. So next we installed these clips that go on the rocker pivot bushings, and these are really difficult to get on by hand, but Jason, out of all three of us there, Jason was the only one who was able to do it by hand. It was pretty easy for him, but I, for the life of me, could not even put one of them on there. So I guess that's what happens to your hands when you work on engines all day long as your career, because I would have needed some pliers or something if that was me. But yeah, we got all those on there, and we started to install the actual pivots themselves. The lash pads can be just dropped on top of the valves. The pivots, of course, get a healthy amount of engine assembly lube. To prepare to install the rocker arms, we installed the cam thrust plate to keep the camshaft in place. So to install the rocker arms, I would recommend that you get this Nissan tool that actually would use the camshaft in place as kind of a point of leverage, and then it compresses the valve springs down like that, and it makes it really easy to install the rocker arms. I didn't have one of those. I definitely intended to buy one. I just I forgot to buy one, frankly. And but my dad and Jason came up with a different way of doing this that I've never seen it before, but it worked just fine, where they kind of would push the rocker arm up against the camshaft, and they would use a screwdriver against that to kind of compress the valve spring. And if you remember from disassembly, it doesn't take too much. You only need a little bit of extra clearance, and that was enough to get it to where they could just kind of slide it on top of the lash pad, and it worked great. So that was the end of day one, and I came back for day two here, and Jason was already hard at work in the engine test room he has set up. He has this crazy intricate setup that he built himself over a course of many years, where he can test all the engines he builds. And I've told you he does mostly racing applications, so it's really important to be able to get, to be able to run this first of all, and get really specific data about how well the engine's running. And they even have this water device that can put it under load to mimic road conditions. So while Jason was getting that engine all squared away, I went and cleaned up all of my timing components, which is going to be the next part of the assembly process here, and got everything laid out so we could see it easily, which is a minor thing but makes a big difference just to again, stay organized. And I didn't replace any timing components, which I probably should have done. The book recommends that you do. But, as you'll see here, so many of these things were in such good condition that it was kind of hard to justify it, especially because this is going to just sit on a stand, and I can do another video where I replace the timing chain, and that might be even more helpful to people to see, hey, this is just this repair on an already built engine.
There you go.
Yeah, you can hear my dad laughing at me there because I said that I had a tough time removing that thing because I was afraid of cracking the front cover for whatever reason. So we reinstalled that thrust plate there. I didn't show you, but we took it off at one point. Because now we're actually going to install it to torque it down. So we had to grease the threads, and because that's how you get a true torque rating, and cleaned up that bolt a little bit more before that went in there, and torqued that down. So at this point, you have to decide, how you're going to time the cam sprocket, because there are 3 settings on it. We went with number 2, that's considered like a little bit more performance timing. 1 is the standard. But it dictates 2 things. It dictates where you install the cam sprocket on the camshaft, and then you're going to have 2 white links on the, or just lighter colored links on the timing chain, and those need to line up on the camshaft, and they need to line up on a particular part of the crank pulley. Next, Jason installed the fuel pump eccentric and the camshaft bolt in place. And then we installed the left and right chain guides. Obviously, again, just in place. We're not torquing anything down just yet. As well as the tensioner mechanism, which we created a small gasket for, as the gasket set does not contain one. A lot of places say that I looked seem to say you can just torque it down, and there was never really a gasket available. But we were trying to be a little bit extra safe there. We reinstalled the 26 millimeter crank pulley bolt that actually got stuck in the socket, and I bought another one, but we're just using this one as it's actually a nice tool to turn the engine. So at this point, Jason began turning the engine, mainly to get it where he wanted it to be for when he's going to be reinstalling the rest of the rocker arm assemblies, and verifying that the timing is correct. So with everything settled there, I was able to torque down all of these timing components. At this point, Jason had to go work on something else, and I took the opportunity to use his stud puller tool, which allows you to just remove these studs like this, and it kind of grips down on them. And surprisingly, it doesn't even gouge the threads at all. I'm obviously going to be replacing these anyways with new hardware, but this doesn't mess them up at all if you did want to use something like this. It's a special snap-on tool. So one of the issues with doing this without having all of my hardware ready from zinc plating, I haven't gotten it all prepared yet, and haven't sent it off to them yet, is just that, we wanted to install the front cover, but obviously, we need to secure it in place with something, which would be the bolts. So right now we decided that we would have Jason install that, and get everything good there, and we would install it with just a few bolts holding it in place. And I think we'll be okay, but we're just putting a few bolts in here now to secure it in place, knowing that we're just going to take those off at some point when I send everything off to get zinc plated. At this point, Jason installed the harmonic balancer, and used my, I guess it's now just a glorified engine turning tool here, my socket with the bolt lodged in it. We just kept that on because it's going to be a useful thing going forward. So as you can see, Jason went ahead and installed the rest of those rocker arms here. And here he's applying some more engine lube to the camshaft because we're going to be turning it a whole lot more here. And he's going to be setting the valve lash soon.
Okay.
So a lot of this final stuff was going late, and I wanted to be able to bring this engine home. So Jason kind of took the rest of this stuff upon himself, like setting the valve latch. So I don't think I'll be able to provide very good commentary on that and what's going on there. And I would encourage you to look at the book that I always recommend, the How to Rebuild Your L Series Engine, as well as other great videos here on YouTube of what to do at this point. We actually had to grind down a wrench to get a small enough one to fit on there. You know, that one, the pivot nut is quite small. And we don't have a special skinny wrench for that. So we had to make do with some Harbor Freight technology and grind it down so it's skinnier. But that worked great, and Jason was able to set the valve lash successfully. So we definitely didn't want to drag this process on longer than it had to be. So while I was gone to pick up the wrench, Jason installed the freeze plugs here and did a couple other kind of tasks that I don't know necessarily needed to be covered here. And it was great because it allowed us to finish this night. So at this point, Jason was able to torque down the camshaft bolt. And that was pretty much it for what we had to do here at the machine shop. And all that was really left to do was to try to package it up, so to speak, for its drive home to Maryland. So I put as much of these kind of pieces as I could to keep the engine protected. And obviously I taped down all kinds of different ports and stuff like that. The engine was also wrapped in some cellophane to provide it probably the best protection we were going to get from the elements, because you can see I couldn't close my truck bed cover. But it made it okay. It was actually pretty snowy on the drive back to Maryland, and as far as I can tell, none of the elements got inside the engine. So I think that is a success there. It was a little bit more difficult to unload the engine than the last time I did this, just because I don't have as much space here. The Camaro to the right of this cannot move at the moment, or it could. It would just be way too loud because the muffler exploded. And I think, this was like 11:30, so I didn't really feel like waking up the neighbors with that. But this went fine. Nothing broke. It was really helpful to have those engine slingers as opposed to just using the studs the last time I did this. Those, the rusty old studs that we don't know which one of them, are going to break as soon as we try to use them to hoist the engine up. And this went pretty smoothly, and it was really exciting to have the engine back down on the ground in my garage. And, I got excited for all the future projects that basically are just going to be finishing this engine. So I'll leave you with this final shot here of, taking off the cellophane. A spoiler, I will tell you, I already painted the engine. I think I did it the next day after this. It's been painted for a while now. I just haven't been able to put together the video. But I just couldn't stand to look at that brown engine and know that I have the paint and everything that I needed to do it. But it's been really cool just to see everything come together. And I'm excited to finish this up and do as much as I can with the engine just on this stand before we build the custom stand for it to run on, and build all the custom accessories that we would want for that. And so yeah, I would encourage you, if you're not already, to subscribe and check out the new videos as they come out. I know this one ended up being a little bit long, but there was just so much going on here. I was going to include the painting in this video too, but it doesn't need to be any longer than it is now. But again, as always, thank you to everyone who has watched. I really appreciate that, and I hope they are helpful to you in some way, or maybe just that you enjoy watching them. So thanks, guys. Take care, and Merry Christmas.